Chasing Lincoln's Killer by James Swanson. Prologue. It looked like a bad day for photographers. Terrible winds and thunderstorms had swept through Washington early that morning, dissolving the dirt streets into a sticky muck of soil and garbage. The ugly gray sky of the morning of March 4th, 1865, threatened to spoil the great day. Photographer William M. Smith was to take a historic photograph of the presidential inauguration in front of the recently completed Capitol dome. Smith framed the view from the marble statue of George Washington on the lawn to the top of the dome, crowned by a statue of freedom. Abraham Lincoln had ordered work on building the Capitol dome to continue during the war as a sign that the Union would go on. Closer to the Capitol, Alexander Gardner set up his camera to photograph the inauguration. Gardner captured not only images of the president, vice president, chief justice, and other honored guests occupying the stands, but also the anonymous faces of hundreds of spectators who crowded the east front of the Capitol. In one photograph, on a balcony above the stands, a young man with a black mustache and wearing a top hat gazes down on the president. It is the famous actor, John Wilkes Booth. Abraham Lincoln rose from his chair and walked toward the podium. He was now at the height of his power, with the Civil War nearly won. Clouds threatened another rainstorm. Then the strangest thing happened. The clouds parted and the sun burst out, flooding the spectacle. The president's speech was brief, just 701 words. Fondly we do hope, fervently we do pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right. As God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. On April 3, 1865, Richmond, Virginia, capital city of the Confederate States of America, fell to Union forces. Now it was only a matter of time before the war would finally be over. In the Union capital, emotions were high. The rebellion was almost over, and the victorious North held a celebration. Children ran through the streets waving little paper flags that read, "We celebrate the fall of Richmond." Across the country, people built bonfires, organized parades, fired guns, shot cannons, and sang patriotic songs. 4 days later, John Wilkes Booth was drinking with a friend at a saloon on Houston Street in New York City. Booth struck the bar table with his fist and regretted a lost opportunity. What an excellent chance I had, if I wished, to kill the president on Inauguration Day. I was on the stand as close to him nearly as I am to you. Crushed by the fall of Richmond, the former rebel capital, John Wilkes Booth left New York City on April 8th and returned to Washington. The news there was terrible for him. On April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia surrendered to Union General Grant at Appomattox. Booth wandered the streets in despair. On April 10th, Abraham Lincoln appeared at a second-floor window of the Executive Mansion, as the White House was known then, to greet a crowd of citizens celebrating General Lee's surrender. Lincoln did not have a prepared speech. He used humor to entertain the audience. "I see that you have a band of music with you. I've always thought Dixie one of the best tunes I've ever heard. Our adversaries attempted to appropriate it, but I insisted yesterday we fairly captured it. I now request the band to favor me with its performance." On the night of April 11th, a torchlight parade of a few thousand people with bands and banners assembled on the semicircular driveway in front of the Executive Mansion. This time, Lincoln delivered a long speech, without gloating over the Union victory. He intended to prepare people for the long task of rebuilding the South. When someone in the crowd shouted that he couldn't see the president, Lincoln's son, Tad, volunteered to illuminate his father. When Lincoln dropped each page of his speech to the floor, it was Tad who scooped them up. Lincoln continued, "We meet this evening not in sorrow, but in gladness of heart." He described recent events and gave credit to Union General Grant and his officers for the successful end to the war. He also discussed his desire that black people, especially those who had served in the Union Army, be given the right to vote. As Lincoln spoke, one observer, Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, a free black woman, standing a few steps from the president, remarked that the lamplight made him stand out boldly in the darkness, the perfect target. What an easy matter would it be to kill the president as he stands there? He could be shot down from the crowd, she whispered, and no one would be able to tell who fired the shot. In that crowd, standing below Lincoln, was John Wilkes Booth. He turned to his companion, David Harold, and objected to the idea that blacks and former slaves would become voting citizens. In the darkness, Booth threatened to kill Lincoln. "By God, now, I'll put him through." As Booth left the White House grounds, he spoke to companion and co-conspirator Lewis Powell. "That is the last speech he will ever give." On the evening of April 13th, Washington celebrated the end of the war with a grand illumination of the city. Public buildings and private homes glowed from candles, torches, gaslights, and fireworks. It was the most beautiful night in the history of the city. John Wilkes Booth saw all of this, the grand illumination, the crowds delirious with joy, the insults to the fallen Confederacy and her leaders. He returned to his room at the National Hotel after midnight. He could not sleep. Chapter 1. John Wilkes Booth awoke depressed. It was Good Friday morning, April 14th, 1865. The Confederacy was dead. His cause was lost and his dreams of glory over. He did not know that this day, after enduring more than a week of bad news, he would enjoy a stunning reversal of fortune. No, all he knew this morning when he crawled out of bed was that he could not stand another day of Union victory celebrations. Booth assumed that the day would unfold as the latest in a blur of days that had begun on April 3rd, when the Confederate capital, Richmond, fell to the Union. The very next day, the tyrant, Abraham Lincoln, had visited his captive prize and had the nerve to sit behind the desk occupied by the first and last President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. Then, on April 9th, at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee and his beloved Army of Northern Virginia surrendered. 2 days later, Lincoln had made a speech proposing to give blacks the right to vote. And last night, April 13th, all of Washington had celebrated with a grand illumination of the city. These days had been the worst of Booth's young life. 26 years old, impossibly vain, an extremely talented actor, and a star member of a celebrated theatrical family, John Wilkes Booth was willing to throw away fame, wealth, and a promising future for the cause of the Confederacy. He was the son of the legendary actor Junius Brutus Booth and brother to Edwin Booth, one of the finest actors of a generation. Handsome and appealing, he was instantly recognizable to thousands of fans in both the North and South. His physical beauty astonished all who saw him. A fellow actor described his eyes as being like living jewels. Booth's passions included fine clothing, Southern honor, good manners, beautiful women, and the romance of lost causes. On April 14th, Booth's day began in the dining room of the National Hotel, where he ate breakfast. Around noon, he walked over to nearby Ford's Theater, a block from Pennsylvania Avenue, to pick up his mail. Ford's customarily accepted personal mail as a courtesy to the actors. There was a letter for Booth. That same morning, a letter arrived at the theater for someone else. There had been no time to mail it, so its sender, First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, had used the president's messenger to hand-deliver it to the owners of Ford's Theater. The mere arrival of the White House messenger told them that the president was coming to the theater tonight. Yes, the president and Mrs. Lincoln would attend this evening's performance of the popular, if silly, comedy, Our American Cousin. But the big news was that General Ulysses S. Grant was coming with them. The Lincolns had given the Fords enough advance notice for the proprietors to decorate and join together the two theater boxes, 7 and 8, that, by removal of a partition, formed the president's box at the theater. By the time Booth arrived at the theater, the president's messenger had come and gone. Sometime between noon and 12:30 p.m., as he sat on the top step in front of the entrance to Ford's reading his letter, Booth heard the big news. In just 8 hours, the man who was the subject of all his hating and plotting would stand on the very stone steps where he now sat. Here, of all places, Lincoln was coming here. Booth knew the layout of Ford's intimately, the exact spot on 10th Street where Lincoln would step out of his carriage, the box inside the theater where the president sat when he came to a performance, the route Lincoln would walk, and the staircase he would climb to the box, the dark underground passageway beneath the stage. He knew the narrow hallway behind the stage where a back door opened to the alley, and he knew how the president's box hung directly above the stage. Though Booth had never acted in Our American Cousin, he knew it well: its length, its scenes, its players, and most important, the number of actors on stage at any given moment during the performance. It was perfect. He would not have to hunt Lincoln. The president was coming to him. He had only 8 hours to prepare. If luck was on his side, there was just enough time to carry out his plan. Whoever told Booth about the president's plan to attend the play that night had unknowingly activated in his mind an imaginary clock that began ticking down minute by minute. He would have a busy afternoon. Abraham Lincoln ate breakfast with his family and planned his day. The Lincoln's eldest son, Robert, a junior officer of General Grant's staff, was home from the war. Robert had been at the surrender at Appomattox, and his father was eager to hear the details. General Grant joined Lincoln's cabinet meeting later that day, where everyone in attendance, including Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton and Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, noticed Lincoln's good mood. Secretary Welles, who kept a diary, wrote that Lincoln had last night the usual dream which he had preceding nearly every great and important event of the war. Lincoln said the dream related to the water, that he seemed to be in some indescribable vessel and that was moving with great speed towards an indefinite shore. He had this dream preceding the great battles of the Civil War. Lincoln had always believed in, and sometimes feared, the power of dreams. In 1863, while visiting Philadelphia, he sent an urgent telegram to Mary Todd Lincoln at the White House, warning of danger to their younger son. "I think you better put Tad's pistol away. I had an ugly dream about him." After the cabinet meeting ended, the president followed his usual routine, receiving visits from friends and job seekers, reading his mail, and catching up on paperwork. He was eager to wind up business by 3:00 p.m. for an appointment he had with his wife, Mary. There was something he wanted to tell her. At the theater, Henry Clay Ford wrote out the advertisement that appeared that afternoon in the Evening Star. Lieutenant General Grant, President, and Mrs. Lincoln have secured the state box at Ford's Theater tonight to witness Miss Laura Keene's Our American Cousin. James Ford walked to the Treasury Department a few blocks away to borrow several flags to decorate the president's box. On his way back, his arms wrapped around a bundle of brightly colored cotton and silk fabric, he bumped into Booth. They spoke briefly. Booth saw the red, white, and blue flags, further confirmation of the president's visit that night. Dr. Charles A. Leal, a 23-year-old U.S. Army surgeon, was on duty at the Armory Square Hospital in Washington when he heard that President Lincoln and General Grant would be at the performance that night. He decided to attend. Leal wanted, most of all, to catch a glimpse of the famous general who had won the Civil War. Booth rode over to the Kirkwood House, where he accomplished his strangest errand of the day. The Kirkwood was the residence of the new vice president, Andrew Johnson, who was from Tennessee. The job did not include official quarters, so he lived at a hotel. Johnson's room was unguarded, and if Booth had wanted to, he could have walked upstairs and knocked on the door, or worse. But he did not want to see or harm the vice president. He just wanted to leave him a note. Booth approached the front desk, wrote a brief note, handed it to the desk clerk, who placed it into Johnson's mail slot. The message read, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you home? J. Wilkes Booth." Next, Booth visited a boarding house on H Street, a few blocks from Ford's Theater, to pay what looked like an innocent social call on the owner, Mary Surratt. She was a 42-year-old Maryland widow and mother of John Harrison Surratt, a Confederate secret agent and a friend of Booth's. Over the last several months, Booth had become a frequent caller at Mrs. Surratt's Washington townhouse. Tonight, her son John was not home. He was out of the city on rebel business. Mary told Booth that she was riding out that afternoon to her country tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland, several miles south of Washington. Booth asked if she would mind delivering a small package wrapped in newspaper to her tavern. Conveniently, Booth had the package with him. There was one more thing. Booth told Mary that he would be riding out of Washington this evening. Sometime that night, he said, he would stop at her tavern to pick up not only this package, but also the guns, ammunition, and other supplies that her son John had already hidden there for him. He asked Mary to tell the tavern keeper, John Lloyd, to get everything ready for the actor's visit this evening. She agreed, and as soon as she and Louis Weichman, one of her boarders, drove down to Surrattsville by carriage. At some point that afternoon, Booth made the final arrangements. There were two types of preparation, practical and mental. First, the weapons. Booth chose as his primary weapon a .44 caliber, single-shot, muzzle-loading pistol manufactured by Henry Derringer of Philadelphia. It was a small, short-barreled, pocket-sized handgun designed for concealment, not combat. Its big .44 caliber ball, weighing in at nearly an ounce, was a solid, deadly round. Unlike military pistols that could fire up to 6 rounds before reloading, the Derringer could be fired just once. Reloading was a time-consuming process that called for 2 hands and more than 20 seconds. Booth knew that his first shot would be his last. If he missed, he wouldn't have time to reload. Booth left behind no explanation for why he chose the Derringer over a revolver. Pistols misfire occasionally. Either the copper percussion cap might fail to spark, or the black powder in the barrel might fail to ignite because of dampness. Booth was a thrill-seeker, so perhaps he wanted to increase his excitement by risking the use of a one-shot pistol. Or did he believe it more heroic, more honorable, even more gentlemanly to take his prey with a single bullet? Perhaps he preferred a stylish single shot to blazing away with a 6-shooter. Then, if he missed or failed to kill the president, he would turn to his backup weapon, a Rio Grande camp knife, a handsome and extremely sharp type of Bowie knife. Before leaving the National Hotel, Booth slid the knife and pistol into his pockets and gathered the rest of his belongings. He planned to travel light that night. In addition to the weapons and his clothing, a black felt slouch hat, black wool coat, black pants, big knee-high black leather riding boots with spurs, he took only a velvet-cased compass, keys, a whistle, a datebook, a pencil, some money, a small knife, and a few other small items, including small photographs of 5 of his favorite girlfriends. When Mary Surratt and her boarder arrived in Surrattsville, the tavern keeper John Lloyd wasn't there. He had left on an errand. Mary waited for him. When Lloyd returned, he parked his wagon, climbed down, and began unloading his cargo of fish and oysters. Mary delivered the message to the tavern keeper John Lloyd. "I want you to have those shooting irons ready. There will be parties here tonight who will call for them." She handed him Booth's package wrapped in newspaper. "The evening callers will want this too," she explained. And she added, "Give them a couple of bottles of whiskey." Her mission accomplished, Mary and Lewis drove back to Washington. Lloyd followed Mary's instructions. He carried the package upstairs, unwrapped it, and discovered Booth's binoculars. He went to a room where several weeks ago John Surratt had shown him how to hide 2 Spencer carbines between the walls. Lloyd retrieved them and placed them with the binoculars in his bedchamber. At the Harrington House Hotel, around the corner from Ford's, at around 8 o'clock p.m., Booth presided over a meeting of some of the conspirators he had recruited over the previous months to strike against President Lincoln. This was not the first time they had assembled to move against the president. They had failed at least once before. Beginning in 1864, Booth, the young stage star, had pledged his cash, his celebrity, and his connections in hatching a bold plan. He put together a harebrained scheme to kidnap President Lincoln, take him to Richmond, and hold him as a hostage for the Confederacy in an effort to help win the war for the South. From the time of Lincoln's election in 1860, there arose several conspiracies to kidnap or murder him. Pro-secession, pro-Southern rebels began mailing death threats to Lincoln before he took office in 1861. Some even sent him jars of poisoned fruit. In one notorious plot of 1861, local rebels schemed to assassinate the president-elect when his railroad train passed through Baltimore on the way to Washington for his first inauguration. But Detective Allen Pinkerton ruined the scheme by persuading Lincoln to pass through the city in disguise, several hours ahead of schedule. Other Lincoln haters threatened to assassinate him on the east front of the Capitol the moment he began to read his inaugural address. During the Civil War, several Southern military officers, as well as a handful of officials in the Confederate Secret Service, considered plots against Lincoln. But big talk was cheap in wartime Washington. As late as January 1865, with the Confederacy in danger of collapse at any moment, not one of the conspiracies resulted in serious action against Abraham Lincoln. At some point, John Wilkes Booth came into contact with sympathetic secret agents in Canada, New York City, Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. In late 1864 and early 1865, Booth organized his own little band of conspirators, loyal to him and not the Confederacy. He recruited a gang who, after he clothed and fed them, paid for their food and drink, and allowed them to enjoy the benefits of his fame and favor, and would, he hoped, follow him anywhere, even into a plot to kidnap the President of the United States. Booth and his gang of conspirators, Lewis Powell, David Herold, John Harrison Surratt, and George Atzerodt, as well as Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, and others who drifted in and out of his circle, would change cheap talk to big action by kidnapping the president. On March 17, 1865, Booth and his henchmen planned, like highway robbers, to ambush Lincoln's carriage at gunpoint on a deserted road as he rode home to the executive mansion. They would make Lincoln their hostage. Booth's information was incorrect, however, and Lincoln did not arrive as expected. Instead, unbelievably, while Booth and his gang lay in wait on the road on the outskirts of the city, Lincoln was giving a speech at Booth's own hotel, the National. If only the kidnapping plot had worked. There would have been no torchlight parades, no crowds serenading Lincoln at the executive mansion, no little children scampering through the streets with little paper flags with red, white, and blue stars and stripes. Although his panicked gang scattered after that ridiculous failure, Booth hoped to try again. But events unfolded quickly when 18 days later Richmond fell and then General Lee surrendered. Lincoln's April 11th speech provoked more violent talk. The president's proposal for limited black citizenship and voting rights enraged the racist actor. But Booth did nothing. If he was serious about assassinating Lincoln, all he had to do was stroll over to the executive mansion, announce that the famous actor John Wilkes Booth wished to see the president, await his turn, which nearly always resulted in a private talk with Lincoln, and then shoot Lincoln at his desk. But that would have been a suicide mission. It would have been difficult to escape the White House. Incredibly, presidential security was very weak in that era. Even during wartime, almost anyone could walk into the executive mansion without being searched and request a brief meeting with the president. It was a miracle that no one had yet tried to murder Lincoln in his own office. Booth would soon turn his anger and violent talk into action. Now, April 14, 1865, Booth assembled enough men to accomplish another mission. Booth proposed, aspiring kidnapper George Atzerodt recalled, that we should kill the president. It would, said Booth, be the greatest thing in the world. Tonight, at exactly 10 o'clock p.m., Booth and his henchmen would throw into chaos the Union government by killing its top leaders. That would, they hoped, incite the Confederacy to continue the war against the Union. George Atzerodt, Lewis Powell, and John Wilkes Booth would strike simultaneously and murder Vice President Johnson, Secretary of State Seward, and President Lincoln. Atzerodt's assignment was to assassinate the vice president in his room at the Kirkwood House. "You must kill Johnson," Booth told him. Lewis Powell would murder Secretary of State Seward. Seward was certain to be in his bed this night, recovering from a serious carriage accident. David Herold, an experienced outdoorsman, hunter, and tracker, would accompany Lewis Powell, take him to Seward's home, and guide the assassin, unfamiliar with the capital streets, out of the city where he would meet up with Booth. Booth claimed the most notorious part of the plot for himself. He would slip into Ford's Theater and assassinate the president during the play. Powell and Herold, Booth's two most loyal pals, agreed to the plan. Atzerodt had doubts about his assignment. He would not do it, he said. Booth then threatened Atzerodt, implying that he might as well kill Johnson, because if he didn't, Booth would accuse him anyway and get him hanged. None of Booth's conspirators knew it, but Booth had already implicated all of them. He had entrusted a sealed envelope to a friend and fellow actor who was to see that the letter it contained was published tomorrow in the newspaper. In the letter, not only did Booth justify the triple assassination, but he signed his henchmen's names to the document as well, sealing their fates. Atzerodt's reluctance to kill Johnson put the whole plot at risk. Atzerodt knew the details of the assassination plan that was unfolding. If he left that meeting and went to the police, Booth, Powell, and Herold would be finished. Guards would rush to protect those threatened in the plot, and the conspirators would be hunted down. Booth would fail in his mission. At the executive mansion, the Lincolns were behind schedule. It was past 8 o'clock p.m., and they still had not gotten into their carriage. As the curtain rose at Ford's, the coachman and Lincoln's servant, Charles Forbes, were on top of the carriage. The Lincolns' private afternoon carriage ride and absence from the mansion had left business unfinished, with several politicians still waiting for an audience with the president. Earlier that afternoon, Lincoln was happy to be free of the politicians and the burdens of his office. It had been one of the happiest days of his life. At breakfast, son Robert told tales of Lee's surrender. For once, the cabinet meeting was free of the crises, battle news, and problems requiring the president's immediate attention. Since Lee's surrender, Lincoln had been more cheerful than at any other time during his presidency. He expected more good news about the surrender of additional Confederate armies. He wanted to ride alone with Mary on this day. She had been emotionally upset since the death of their 11-year-old son Willie in 1862. They both took the loss hard, but Abraham Lincoln had recovered, and Mary had not. It was hard to lose the boy, he said. He organized Willie's funeral. Then he threw himself into his work. Mary was at heart a kind woman, but some critics preferred to criticize her personal quirks, her expensive shopping habits, her jealous temper, rather than praise her good works for soldiers or her absolute loyalty to her husband, liberty, and the Union cause. The demands of the war had been so great that the president spent less and less time with Mary. Lincoln knew that had to change now that the war was ending. He wanted to talk to Mary about their future. He walked her to the open carriage, his good mood impossible to miss. Mary Todd Lincoln had noticed his recent optimism, and now, during their afternoon carriage ride, she spoke to him about it. "Dear husband, you almost startle me by your great cheerfulness." Lincoln replied, "We must both be more cheerful in the future. Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable." During their leisurely ride, the president told his wife that they must try to be happy again, that he would like to see the Pacific Ocean, that perhaps at the end of his second term in office, they would move to Chicago and he would practice law again. Freed from the troubles of war and death, he would send no more armies of young men to die. Lincoln dreamed of the future. Mary later remembered, "I never saw him so supremely cheerful. His manner was even playful." That evening, when the Lincolns finally left the White House for Ford's, they picked up their guests. General Grant and his wife had declined Lincoln's invitation and boarded a train headed for home instead. Several other couples had also declined the invitation, but Major Rathbone, an Army officer, and his fiancée, Clara Harris, accepted. At 8:00 p.m., the management at Ford's decided not to hold the curtain for the presidential party, and the play began without them. Soon, an employee acting as lookout at Ford's spotted the big black carriage turning down 10th Street. It slowed to a stop beside the wood platform in front of the theater, constructed especially to assist carriage riders in getting out of their vehicles and avoiding the muddy street. The Lincolns, Henry Rathbone, and Clara Harris exited the carriage. The chief usher escorted them through the lobby, up the winding staircase, and across the first balcony to the theater box. Abraham Lincoln's entry to Ford's Theater at 8:30 p.m. on April 14, 1865, was majestic and simple. He arrived with no crowd of guards or staff, and no announcement to the audience. Before the presidential party reached the box, the actors, musicians, and theatergoers became aware of the Lincolns' arrival. The actors on stage stopped performing. To the delight of the crowd, the conductor led the orchestra in Hail to the Chief, the traditional musical accompaniment to the entrance of the president. Dr. Charles Leal, seated in front of the first balcony, about 40 feet from the president's box, had arrived in time to witness it all. He watched the audience rise to its feet in enthusiasm and cheer. He looked around, too, and watched as Lincoln looked upon the people he loved and acknowledged them with a solemn bow. At this supreme moment, the people cheered the man who, after a shaky start in office, learned how to command armies, brought down slavery, and became a most eloquent and moving speaker. And, as he promised he would, he had saved the Union. Lincoln stood in the box and bowed to the audience. The outpouring of emotion from the audience and orchestra, the hissing gaslights, the packed house, the fresh, moist scent of spring in the air, the recent and happy news from the Army, all combined to make a magical moment. Chapter 2. Legend has it that John Wilkes Booth was hiding out in the shadows near the front door of Ford's as the presidential carriage rocked down the dirt street and slowed. Wherever he was, it is almost certain that he somehow watched with his own eyes to be certain that the Lincolns were actually inside the theater, and he probably wondered whether other guests in the box were the type who would pose a threat to his plans. It didn't matter, really. No one was going to stop him from going through with it. It was now about 9 p.m., time for Booth to go inside the theater for the first time since the Lincolns had arrived. Although the actor had entered the theater after the performance had started, he was still on schedule. The play was like a clock. Every word spoken was another tick of the second hand. After hearing some familiar dialogue, Booth would know to the minute how much time remained in the performance. He knew that he had at least another hour. He left Ford's. In a little while, he returned to his alley stable where he'd left his rented horse, a bay mare. He led the horse down the alley by the reins to the back door of Ford's theater. He asked theater employee Edmund Spangler to hold his horse for him. Spangler said he was too busy moving scenery. Another theater employee, named John Peanut, for the snacks he sold to theater patrons, held the reins of Booth's restless horse while the actor went inside. Once inside Ford's, Booth wanted to cross behind the stage to the other side of the building where a door led to a narrow passageway that ran to the front of the theater. Booth asked an employee if he could sneak across the stage concealed by scenery. That was impossible, he was told, as a scene that required the full stage was being performed, and there was nowhere to hide from the audience by creeping behind scenery. Instead, Booth would have to cross under the stage and emerge on the other side. Booth lifted a trap door and dropped down into darkness. He could hear the wooden planks of the stage creaking overhead, the distant, muffled voices of the actors, and laughter from the audience. He climbed the stairs at the edge of the passageway, nudged open the trap door, and entered the area that ran lengthwise between Ford's and the saloon next door. He emerged on 10th Street. Anyone who saw him now would assume he had come down 10th Street to take in the play. No one in the theater, except a few employees, knew he had a horse waiting out back. There was time for one last drink. Booth walked into the Star Saloon at around 10 p.m. The narrow, dimly lit saloon attracted actors, stagehands, and playgoers from Ford's theater next door. Alone, he drank whiskey. Any customers who recognized the handsomest, best-dressed man in Washington kept it to themselves and did not disturb him. Booth slapped a few coins on the bar and left without saying a word. As he exited onto 10th Street, he noticed the president's carriage, parked and waiting to take Lincoln back home. In the alley behind Ford's, John Peanut walked Booth's impatient horse back and forth. It was time. Booth entered the theater lobby, listening to the dialogue on stage. He was still on schedule. He climbed the curving staircase to the balcony, following the same path the Lincolns took to their box. He walked slowly along the wall. One theater patron, still hoping to witness General Grant's arrival, looked up from his first-floor seat and saw a man approaching the box. He recognized Booth. Booth could see the door of the vestibule that led directly into the president's box. What he saw, or what he did not see, surprised him. The door was unguarded. He expected to see an officer, a soldier, or at least a policeman seated there. Instead, seated near but not blocking the door, was Lincoln's servant, Charles Forbes. Booth showed Forbes something. To this day, no one knows what words they exchanged or what Booth showed him. Was it a letter or a calling card? A card with Booth's name on it would open almost any door in Washington. Forbes did not attempt to stop him. Booth turned the doorknob and pushed open the vestibule door. There was no guard. No one stood between him and the President of the United States. Inside the box, the Lincolns were enjoying themselves, not because of the play, but simply from being together, out of the White House, during their happiest week in Washington. Seated in his rocking chair, perhaps thinking of their carriage ride that afternoon, Lincoln reached out and held Mary's hand. In pretend embarrassment, Mary scolded her husband for his boldness. "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" Lincoln replied to the last words he would ever hear his wife speak. "She won't think anything about it." He smiled at her affectionately. Booth closed the outer vestibule door behind him so quietly that no one heard anything. Bending down, he felt along the edge of the carpet near the wall for the pine bar, part of the music stand he'd hidden there that afternoon. When no one was watching, he had entered Ford's, sneaked into the vestibule and box, and made his preparations. He found the bar now, grabbed it with both hands, and wedged it quietly, tightly, between the wall and the door. Now no one could follow him into the president's box. The actor's black eyes adjusted to the darkness while fixing on the only light in the dim room, a faint pinpoint of light coming from the peephole that someone, probably Booth, had bored through a panel in the door into the box. Booth peeked through the dot of light on the door, seeing the interior of the box. Lincoln sat on the far left of the box, closest to Booth in his rocking chair. The left side of the president's body turned toward the audience. He faced the stage below. Mary sat to Lincoln's right, seated on a wood chair. On her right was Clara Harris, and next to her, Major Rathbone, seated on a sofa. Booth could enter the box and shoot Lincoln without having to get past the Major. On stage, there were still 4 scenes left before the end of the play. It was around 10 o'clock p.m. Booth plunged his hands into his pocket and withdrew his weapons. In his right hand was the .44 caliber Derringer pistol, and in his left, the sharp Rio Grande camp knife. The actor Harry Hawk entered the stage. It was not time yet. There were still too many actors on stage. Booth listened to the dialogue of the play for his signal. In a few moments, Booth knew Harry Hawk would be alone on stage and would speak a line guaranteed to produce such energetic laughter that it would drown out the sound of just about anything, including, Booth hoped, the sound of a gunshot. Booth's thumb pulled back the hammer of the Derringer until he heard it cock into firing position. His hand reached for the doorknob. Though he could not see the stage, he could hear the dialogue. Now, Booth knew, only 2 actors remained on stage. The tension was unbearable. The dialogue spoken on stage no longer sounded like words, but like the last ticks of a dying clock winding down. It was 10:13 p.m. Once Harry Hawk was alone on stage, Booth opened the door and stepped into the president's box. Hawk began reciting the last sentence Lincoln would ever hear, a series of corny insults that delighted the audience. Lincoln was so near. If Booth wished to, he could reach out and tap him with the muzzle of the pistol. No one in the box had seen or heard him enter. They all continued to watch the action on stage. Booth began the performance he had rehearsed in his mind again and again. He stepped forward toward Lincoln, raised his right arm to shoulder height, and extended the pistol forward. He was so close to the president now that all he had to do was point the Derringer. Booth squeezed the trigger. The comic line, spoken by Harry Hawk, "You sockdologizing old man-trap," was followed by an explosion of laughter from the audience. The black powder charge exploded and spit the bullet toward Lincoln's head. The muzzle flash lighted the box for a moment like a miniature lightning bolt. Had Booth succeeded? If he had only wounded Lincoln, then the president, even at 56 years old, would have been a worthy opponent. The idea of the president fighting back against the young, leaping, and sword-fighting actor is not as far-fetched as it sounds. With his creased and weary-looking face atop a thin, 6'4" frame, President Lincoln might have looked old and weak. The war had taken its toll, but beneath his baggy coat and trousers, there was a lean and strong body. Too soon, doctors would discover and be amazed at the apparent difference in age between his face and his body. Lincoln had not seen Booth coming. The bullet struck him in the side of the head, on the lower left side, just below the ear. The ball ripped through his chestnut-colored hair, cut the skin, penetrated the skull, and because of the angle of Lincoln's head at the moment of impact, made a diagonal tunnel through Lincoln's brain. The wet brain matter slowed the ball's speed, absorbing enough of its energy to prevent it from exiting the other side of the skull through the president's face. The ball came to rest in Lincoln's brain behind his right eye. Lincoln never knew what happened to him. His head dropped forward, his body lost all muscle control, and sagged against the rocking chair. The sound of the pistol shot hung in the box for several seconds. It traveled to the stage below and echoed throughout the theater. The pistol shot did startle some people in the audience. Some thought it was part of the play. Some people did not hear it at all. Major Henry Rathbone, seated in the box just feet away from the president, was an experienced Army officer, familiar with the sounds of gunshots. He was the first to realize that something was very wrong. He turned to his left. The smoke from the gun, now tinted red from the gas lights, partly blocked his vision. Rathbone rose from his seat and stepped in the direction of the president. At that moment, he saw a wild-eyed man, his face ghostly against his black clothes, hair, and mustache. Like a demon, Booth emerged from the cloud of black powder and sprang at him. Rathbone lunged for Booth, grabbing him by the coat. The assassin broke free, shouting, "Freedom!" and throwing his right arm up as high as it could reach. Rathbone saw what Booth had clenched in his fist, a large, shiny blade, its knife pointed directly down at him. At the last moment, Rathbone raised his arm to protect himself from what was intended to be a death blow. The major grunted in pain. His quick defensive move had saved his life, but the blade sliced through his sleeve and into his upper arm. Blood gushed from the deep wound. Booth wasted no more time finishing off Rathbone. The clock in his head was still ticking down. If he was going to escape the theater, he had to get out of the box at once. He swung his leg over the side of the railing at the front of the box. By now, some members of the audience had looked up, seeing a man climbing out of the president's box. As Booth positioned for a leap to the stage, Rathbone came at him again, grabbing his coat tail. Thrown off balance, Booth got tangled in the framed portrait of George Washington hanging on the front of the box. One of his riding spurs snagged on the flags that decorated the box. He managed to free himself and landed, off balance, but still on his feet. He felt something wrong with his left leg, near the ankle, but there was nothing he could do about it now. Booth scrambled to center stage, turned to the audience, and stood up straight. Though every second was precious to his escape, he knew that this was his last appearance on the American stage. This would be the performance he would be remembered for. All eyes were on him. He stood still, paused to build suspense, and thrust his bloody dagger victoriously into the air. The gashed stage lights shone on the shiny blade now stained with blood. "Sic semper tyrannis!" he thundered. It was the state motto of Virginia, thus always to tyrants. Then Booth shouted, "The South is avenged!" Harry Hawk, the only actor on stage when Booth made the leap, did not understand what was happening. Hawk, more than anyone else in the theater, was in the best position to hear the shot and see Booth climb onto the balcony. Hawk had known Booth and was not likely to mistake him. Hawk stood directly in Booth's escape path. When Booth had nearly reached him, Hawk fled. As Booth moved across the stage, heading for the wings, one audience member heard him say to himself, "I've done it." Booth fled into the wings, slashing his dagger at anyone who got in his way. The orchestra conductor said he felt Booth's hot breath as the assassin pushed past him and struck at him with the knife. He did not attempt to stop Booth, nor did anyone in the cast try. Booth had taken all the actors backstage by surprise and rushed past them. A voice cried out from the president's box, "Stop that man!" Some in the audience gasped with fright and delight. They still thought it was part of the play. "Will no one stop that man?" An anguished Major Rathbone again pleaded to the crowd below. Clara Harris shouted out, "He has shot the president!" Chapter 3. Less than a mile away, near the White House, all was quiet at the home of Secretary of State William H. Seward. Confined to his bed since a terrible carriage accident the week before, Seward drifted in and out of consciousness. The night of the accident, Seward's face swelled so badly that his children could barely recognize him, and the blood pouring through his nose almost suffocated him. Seward's doctors warned the family to keep him under constant watch. 4 days after the carriage accident, Lincoln walked from the White House to Seward's big brick mansion nearby to check on Seward. The accident worried Lincoln. Carriage accidents were serious in wartime Washington and could prove deadly. The sight of Seward, alive if not well, relieved Lincoln. During the war, Lincoln and Seward had become good friends and trusted confidants. After talking quietly for an hour, Lincoln left and never saw Seward again. Now, on April 14th, Fanny Seward watched over her father and listened to the sights and sounds of the celebrations in the streets. A torchlight parade marched to the White House. A band played patriotic songs. Fanny was a tall, slender, brown-haired girl, educated in literature and politics, and at age 20, her father's favorite. A devoted and talented writer with an eye for detail, her secret diary, which she began at 14, detailed her observations and encounters with the political, military, and diplomatic elite. Outside the mansion, in the shadows, Lewis Powell and David Herold were keeping the Seward house under close watch. The street was quiet. They saw no guards at the front door or anywhere on the street. The newspapers reported Seward's carriage accident and described the serious injuries he had suffered, noting that he was recovering at home, bedridden. That made Seward, of all of Lincoln's cabinet officers, Booth's most appealing target tonight. The other cabinet officers could be anywhere, dinner parties, traveling, and would be difficult to track. Seward, lying helplessly in bed, was sure to be home when the assassins arrived. Booth issued simple instructions to his henchmen: invade the house, locate the Secretary of State's bedroom, and kill the defenseless victim with pistol fire and, if necessary, a knife. This was a difficult mission, even for a man like Powell, a battle-hardened and extremely strong ex-Confederate soldier. Powell had 3 problems. First, how was he to enter the house? The door surely locked. He would have to ring the bell. If someone answered, could he just shoot or slash his way in? That might attract the attention of pedestrians or awaken the occupants of the house to defend themselves. Deception, not brute force, was the key. They came up with a brilliant plan. Powell would pretend he was a messenger delivering important medicine from Seward's doctor. To make his story more believable, Powell carried a small package wrapped in paper and tied with string. Powell's second problem was that he would have to track down Secretary Seward himself, not just deliver the package to a servant or nurse. How would he find him in the large 3-story mansion? Powell's third challenge: how many people were in the house? Seward might be attended by nurses, doctors, servants, maids, family members, and guards. There were certainly several people there, perhaps up to a dozen. Powell, fiercely loyal to Booth, ignored the risk and agreed to proceed with the plan. David Harold also went along, as long as he did not have to kill anybody and could wait for Powell outside, holding their horses. From the shadows, Powell and Harold watched Seward's doctors leave. The house was quiet now. They watched the gas lights go dim in several rooms, indicating that the occupants were settling in for the night. Powell handed his horse to Harold and walked across the street to the secretary's front door. He rang the bell. Harold scanned up and down the block as he stood watch, keeping their horses ready. On the first floor of the house, a black servant named William Bell hurried to answer the door. Late-night callers, mostly messengers, were not unusual. There was no reason why the servant should not open that door. Before him stood a tall, attractive, muscular man, well-dressed in fine leather boots, black pants, jacket, and hat. He was holding a small package in his hands. The deception had worked. Nothing about Powell's appearance raised suspicion in William Bell. He greeted Powell and asked politely how he could help the visitor. Powell explained that his mission: he was a messenger with medicine from Seward's doctor. That sounded reasonable. The servant reasoned that the doctor must have prescribed some medicine and ordered it to be delivered to Seward immediately. Powell stepped into the hall and closed the door behind him. Bell reached out to accept the package. "No," Powell said. "The doctor said he had to deliver it personally to the Secretary of State and instruct him how to take the medicine." The servant said he would take the delivery up himself. Powell insisted. "I must go up." He must see the secretary personally. Those were his instructions. For 5 minutes, the assassin and the servant argued about whether Powell would leave the medicine with Bell. "I must go up," he repeated. "I must go up." Powell inched toward the staircase, backing Bell up to the landing. The servant was in grave danger now. Powell was almost out of patience. Powell lifted a boot to the first step, then another to the second. Bell chattered on, but Powell kept pounding up the stairs slowly, his boots striking the steps with dull thuds that echoed to the floors above. Luckily for Bell, he did not try to block Powell's path. Instead, he climbed the stairs with him. At the top of the staircase, Seward's son Frederick confronted Bell and the stranger. Powell did not know it, but Frederick stood only a few feet from the closed door to the room where Secretary Seward lay. The stranger explained his mission again. Frederick explained that his father was asleep and that he would take delivery of the medicine for him. Again, Powell refused, arguing that he must see the secretary. Incredibly, Powell, thanks to the little package he showed as a prop, had still not created suspicion about his true intentions. To Frederick, he seemed like a stupid and stubborn messenger. From inside her father's bedroom, Fanny Seward sensed someone was in the hall. She hurried to the door and opened it only a little to shield her father from the bright gaslight from the hall. She saw her brother and the tall stranger in the hat and overcoat. She whispered, "Fred, father is awake now." She knew in an instant that she had done wrong. Powell leaned forward and tried to peek into the dark room, but Fanny held the door close, and the assassin was not able to see his target. He stared at Fanny and in harsh and impatient tone demanded, "Is the secretary asleep?" Then Fanny made a terrible mistake. She glanced back into the room in the direction of her father and replied, "Almost." Frederick Seward grabbed the door and shut it quickly. It was too late. Innocently, Fanny had given Powell the information he desperately needed. Secretary of State William H. Seward was in that room, lying helplessly in bed, defended by no one, Powell probably assumed, but a frail-looking girl. Powell did not know that Sergeant Robinson was in the bedroom too. Robinson, a wounded veteran, was serving as an Army nurse, keeping watch over Seward as he recovered. Frederick, still arguing with Powell, gave him an order: surrender the medicine or take it back to the doctor. Powell glared, still refusing to give up his package. He finally pretended to give up, stuffed the package into his pocket, turned around, and started to walk down the stairs. He did not remove his hand from his pocket. William Bell, walking down ahead of Powell, looked ahead to the front door through which, in a few moments, he would take the ill-mannered visitor into the street. At the top of the stairs, Frederick Seward, satisfied at turning away an annoying pest, took his eyes off Powell and headed for his room. In an instant, Powell turned and rushed up the stairs. Before Frederick could turn around, Powell stood behind him. Seward whirled around, but too late. Powell was pointing a revolver at him, the muzzle inches from his face. In another moment, a .36 caliber bullet would explode in his face, and the hot black powder would at such close range not only kill him instantly, but also burn his flesh a hideous black. Powell, staring into Frederick's eyes, squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell and struck the percussion cap. Seward had no time to move. He knew he was dead. Then he heard a metallic click. Misfire. The gun had not fired off its round. Frederick was still alive. But Powell, unlike his master Booth, had 5 more rounds in his revolver. He could draw the hammer back with his thumb and take another shot. Then Powell made a mistake that jeopardized his mission. Instead of trying to fire again, Powell raised the pistol high in the air and brought down a crushing blow to Frederick's head. He hit him so hard that he broke the pistol, jamming the cylinder and making it impossible to fire the weapon again. In a fury, using all his strength, Powell clubbed Frederick Seward with the barrel of the broken revolver. William Bell ran down the stairs and into the street, shouting, "Murder!" Watching from across the street, a nervous David Harold knew that this was not part of the plan. Fanny, unaware of the chaos on the other side of the door, sat in the chair beside her father. She heard the sounds of Frederick being beaten and wondered what the noise was in the hallway. As soon as Sergeant Robinson opened the door, Fanny saw a horrible sight. Her brother's face, wild-eyed, covered with blood. Powell moved quickly. He shoved Frederick aside and struck Sergeant Robinson in the forehead hard with the knife, stunning him with the blow. The assassin pushed past the stumbling sergeant and the frail girl blocking his path. He ran to Secretary Seward's bed, clutching the knife in his right hand and the pistol in his left. In near darkness, Fanny raced Powell to her father's bed, trying in vain to throw her slender body between the huge assassin and her helpless father. The assassin reached the bed and pounced on Seward. "Don't kill him!" she shouted. Seward awoke, trying weakly to raise himself. He saw Fanny, then glimpsed Powell's unforgettable, rugged face and burning eyes. The assassin pushed hard onto the secretary's chest, pinning him to the bed. Powell used every ounce of strength he had to land a tremendous blow, but in the dark, he missed twice. Determined not to miss again, he delivered a third mighty blow aimed at Seward's throat. The agonized groan that came from the bed told Powell that he had finally hit his target. The blade slashed open Seward's cheek so viciously that the skin hung from a flap, exposing his teeth and fractured jawbone. His cheek resembled a fish gill. Seward choked on the warm, metallic-tasting blood that spurted from his mouth and poured down his throat. Across the room, Sergeant Robinson regained his senses. He would fight to the death before he allowed the assassin to murder the secretary and Miss Fanny. He charged into Powell. In an instant, the 2 battle-hardened Civil War veterans grappled in a death struggle. Powell's strength surprised Robinson. He could barely hold on to him as Powell went for Seward again. Fanny screamed in an endless, howling, terrifying wail that woke her brother Augustus, who was sleeping in a room nearby. She opened a window and screamed into the street below. That was enough to frighten David Harold into fleeing. He kicked his horse and fled, abandoning Lewis Powell. Powell kept fighting. Powell's experiences as a soldier would not permit one man and a screaming girl to scare him off. Augustus Seward, dressed in his nightshirt, raced to his father's room and saw the shadows of two men fighting. Confused, he thought his father had become delirious, and the male nurse, Sergeant Robinson, was trying to restrain him. As soon as he grabbed the shadowy figure he thought was his father, he knew it was someone else. Now combating two men, Powell fought harder, slashing wildly with the knife. He stabbed Robinson twice in the shoulder, deeply and to the bone. Robinson ignored the wounds and kept fighting. The sergeant and Augustus wrestled Powell into the hall and into the bright gaslight. Powell and Augustus, their faces inches apart, fixed their eyes on each other. Then Powell spoke. In an intense but calm voice, the assassin confided to Augustus, as though trying to persuade him the strangest thing. "I'm mad! I'm mad!" Powell wound his arm around Robinson's neck in a chokehold, and the sergeant braced himself for the knife that was sure to follow at any moment. Then, in a curious act of mercy, Powell let him go, and instead of stabbing him again, hit him with his fist. Powell fled down the stairs, out into the street, his eyes searching desperately for David Harold. He found nothing more than his lone horse. Powell tossed his knife to the ground, mounted his horse, and, instead of galloping into the night, calmly trotted away. William Bell, waving his arms in the street, pursued Powell on foot for a few blocks, yelling all the way. Unable to keep up with the horse, he gave up and returned to the Seward house. Fanny ran back to her father's room only to find the bed empty. She saw what she thought was no more than a pile of discarded bedsheets on the floor, but it was her father, in a bloody heap. To save his own life, he had rolled out of bed during the attack and crashed to the floor, hoping to escape Powell's reach in the dark room. Fanny slipped on a big puddle of blood and tumbled to the floor beside her father. He looked ghastly, white, and very thin. That made her scream, mistakenly, "Oh my God, Father's dead!" Sergeant Robinson, ignoring his own wounds, lifted the injured Seward from the floor and laid him tenderly in his bed. Seward opened his eyes, looked at his terrified daughter, and, in unimaginable pain, spit the blood out of his mouth and whispered, "I'm not dead. Send for a doctor. Send for the police. Close the house."